Hello students, this is going to be a tutorial about box modeling, and this is in conjunction with our robot character assignment that we have going in DES 3600 right now. So I'll try to walk you through the process of doing some box modeling there. So first of all, I'm just starting off with a blank a default scene here with my default cube, default camera placement, default point light, and of course, since I'm going to be doing some modeling here, it's best for me to start off in an orthographic viewport. So I tapped 5 on the number pad. I'm going to go to my front view and try to get kind of set up here. So one of our students has generously provided her model sheet for this assignment, so I'm going to load up some reference images before I get too far with anything. So tap N on the keyboard to open up my properties panel over here, and then I'm going to put a checkbox down here where it says background images, twirl that down and add an image. I'll click on open and go to the location where my images are saved, which is my 3D classes folder here, and then I've got this JPEG that I'm going to be using. We load it up, and since this is the front view, as you can see up here, I'm going to line this view up with the front view of the model sheet. So I tapped Z on the keyboard to get a wireframe view, and I'm going to come down here where my background image's position is controlled, and I'm going to move it in X. And that's moving a little bit fast. Let's kind of get this whole thing lined up here. I'm going to move it in X. And then I'm going to hold down Shift to move in smaller increments. Then when I start getting close to the right spot, that looks almost evenly divided. I'd say that's probably a little too small, so you can see the increments I'm moving in here. 3.94 looks almost right. A little too far to the left. Next increment is 3.92, so let's try 3.93, right between those. Maybe 3.935. And to me, that still looks like it's got a little too much of the drawing on the left side, so maybe I'll go back to 3.94. Maybe that was about right. 3.945. Let's try that. Okay, and I think I'm happy with that. Now I've got to remember I've moved this in Y. You might notice that my Y value for the position of this image is minus 2.6. That's going to be important in a minute because I can see that the student who provided this artwork has already lined the front and side views of this image up vertically. And I just moved this image vertically, so I want to make sure that when I bring this same image into my side orthographic viewport, right now I'm in front, when I bring it into the side view, I want to make sure that it is still lined up in Y. So I'm going to use that exact same Y value because I'm going to bring the same image in. And it's already lined up the two views on this image, so I shouldn't need to use a different value for this Y value here. Anyway, the last thing I need to do for this front view here is to change it from an all views background image to just a front view background image. That ought to do the trick. Okay, so let's line up our side view. Right now we're in front orthographic. I'm going to tap 3 on my number pad and go to my side view. I'm going to collapse this first image here and add another image. This one's just going to be for my right side since that's where I'm at, right orthographic. And I don't need to browse for my image again. It's already loaded into Blender's database, so I can just click this little icon here and select an image that I already have. Now, you might notice that the artwork is well above my default cube here. And remember, that's because I already dialed in a Y value for this image in the previous view. Minus 2.6 is going to put that where I want it. So I'm going to start off by typing minus 2.6 for this image again, just to get things about where I want them. Now, looking at this side view of the drawing of this robot here, while this robot is symmetrical from side to side, it is not symmetrical from front to back. So my placement here, the placement of the robot is going to be a little bit arbitrary. It's going to be just kind of where I think it ought to be. So I'm going to kind of roughly center it, and that's about all I need to do. So if I look at my front view now, my side view, those are lining up vertically correctly. Now we've also got a top view provided for us here. So let's look at our top view. And in our top view, this area is the front, and this area is the back. I can tell that because from our front view, that green axis, which is the y-axis, disappears. I'm looking straight down it. Okay, so from our top view here, I need to know which side is the front and which side is the back so that I can point the image the correct way. So let's collapse this latest image we added, add another one. Again, we don't need to browse, we can just select from our database. And I can see that this top view here is facing the wrong direction. And it's probably, it looks to me like from side to side, left to right, like it's lined up with this front view. So we can probably, we might be able to reuse some values there. Well, no, we won't, because we're flipping the image around. So let's rotate this image. Let's change it from all views to just being a top view image. And let's rotate that 180 degrees. This is the part that we're shooting for to get lined up over here. And I'm going to just start centering that using the same technique. Now this one's going to be a little bit more difficult to center. At least we have this nice tail point to kind of guide us in here. I think I made this JPEG a little too high in terms of resolution. I exported it at 1200 DPI, and so my system seems to be slowing down a little bit here. It's spinning up some hard drives for whatever it wants to do with them. There we go. Okay. Zoom in just a little, and I'm going to try, yep. Let's see, so minus 3.96 is too far to the left. So let's go minus 3.95 and see what that looks like. And that looks spot on to me. Okay, now the other complication that we've got here is from a top view. Like, we lined up our side view here fairly arbitrarily, right? But we need to have the front of the robot in side view line up with the front of the robot in top view, because those need to be, that's something that actually does need to line up. So I'm going to actually take my cube here, and I'm just going to move it right to just exactly the front of the head, and that should give me a frame of reference for getting the top view into position. I should be able to place the front of the robot's head right on that front of that cube there, and then that should be in position now. Okay. And I think we're good. So we're ready to start modeling here. Now with box modeling, it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. We're just going to start with a box, and we're going to manipulate that box until it becomes our model. One advantage of modeling a robot is we don't necessarily need all these parts to flow into each other like they're all covered with one contiguous layer of skin or something like that. Robots are made out of separate pieces. And that makes them a little easier to model. So I'm going to tab into edit mode on my cube here, and I'm going to do a loop cut and slide to cut this cube in half. We're going to do a mirror modifier so that we only have to model one side of this image. Control R, of course, is a shortcut for that. I mouse over an axis, or an edge, sorry, that is perpendicular to the cut that I want. I click to perform the loop cut portion of the command, and then it transitions me into the slide portion, which I don't want to do. I want this cut to be exactly in the middle, so I hit escape to opt out of that portion of the command, and then I tap Z to go into a wireframe view, tap B to do a box selection of one side of this cube, and I delete those vertices there. And then from here I can just add my mirror modifier over in this modifier stack over here. You can see that it is mirroring along the x-axis, so I once again have what looks like a whole cube thanks to my modifier. So I'm going to click clipping, make sure, just grab these edges and move them, try to move them across that middle line in X, and I can see that they won't move, which that's a good sign. That means that they are joining together, they're welded together with the other half. They're not close, they are exactly contiguous and joining, so that's important. Okay, so I've got my box in place, and from here basically I can kind of start moving this initial box into position. This is going to become the body of the robot. I can tab into edit mode here and basically just kind of start scaling and moving and extruding, rotating, scaling, and this is basically box modeling. Tap C to do a little circle select there. And I'm just kind of going to approximate this shape. You know, we're really not building anything terribly precise yet. We just kind of want to get it looking about like it should. So move, scale, rotate, extrude, grab, rotate, scale. Just kind of keep going that way. Until you have about the shape that you should. And I can see that right here, that that little arch of the back and the roundness of the belly isn't really happening, so I'm going to do a loop cut there, opt out of the slide portion, and just scale that up to kind of fit a little more what I want that shape to look like. And you might notice I'm doing this whole thing in wireframe. Whoops, I keep moving my Shift S, cursor to center, keep moving my cursor by right clicking on accident. You might notice I'm doing this whole thing in wireframe mode. That's to make sure that I'm selecting all the way through this shape. I don't want to just be moving these outer vertices. I want to move the vertex in the center as well. So when those are lined up perfectly, in a center or in a named viewport, then I can, as long as I'm in a wireframe view, I can select all the way through them. You know what, this is getting really slow here with this image. It's just too high resolution. I'm really taking a performance hit. So I'm going to actually open that image in Photoshop, and I am going to oops, wrong one. I am going to shrink it down and replace it in Blender. So that I can get rid of that performance hit I'm taking. How big is this thing anyway? Image size, and it's 13,000 pixels by 10,000. Yeah, that's way too big. So let's, I'm going to take that down to like 25% of its original size. We really don't need it that big. Hit save. Quality doesn't even need to be all the way up to 12. Okay, let's quit Photoshop. Now, if I come back in here in Blender, you'll see that hasn't really made a difference. That's because I need to reload my images. So let's hit that little reload button right there. Reload. Reload. Okay. Let's see if that made any difference. That does seem to be performing better for us. And it's still a little laggy, actually. Just to be weird, I'm going to open this image in the UV image editor. Let's see. And okay, it is reading it smaller now, so that's good. Just kind of want to make sure I'm looking at the resolution right here. So that's a little better. That should help. So now I'll close my window, continue on with my box modeling. Okay, so do a selection all the way through, box select or a circle select, either one of those will work for that. And let's just kind of keep on going with our little operation here. The neck, I think, will go up inside of the head a little bit. I'm not 100% sure how that's going to work yet, so I'm just kind of going to put this in here as a placeholder for now. Okay, and now you can see we've kind of got this shape. It's a decent little shape, but it's very, very flat on the sides compared to, let's look at our front view. You can see that our student has provided a fairly round shape. Looking at this from the side, we don't have a loop here that is necessary to describe this roundness, anything kind of sticking out on the edges. So I'm going to do a loop cut down the middle here, escape out so I don't slide it around. We're just going to leave it in the middle, and that is going to allow us to now select these outer edges here. Yeah, I know there's a faster way to do that, but I was committed, I guess. Okay, and then I'm just going to GX, move those things in the X-axis. Whoop. And you know what? I might, oh, I don't want that selected. I might get rid of the selections on the edge of the tail there. GX, because you can see with the clipping modifier, those are getting a little too close together back there. So let's maybe leave the back end of the tail out of this. GX. Okay, and that's starting to look a little better. If I look at that from the side, basically I just kind of brought the edges in there. And now I can come in and I can deal with these tail pieces separately, just sort of bring them in. I mean, you want the tail to come to sort of a nice point back here. GX, 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 GX. And that's looking a little better. I think it's still a little flat on top. GX, let's kind of... Well, let's look at it from a top view. Actually, we have one here. I can see from a top view that's way too flat, right? I mean, it's too thick on the outer edges. We've just got to be really careful not to smash these ends together in such a way that they start clipping together. We don't want that. Up. Yeah, this is performing so much better now that I shrunk that image down. Okay. Now we're getting there. This top view is pretty handy. It's not really technically required in the model sheet, but if you want to kind of calculate where the top view should be, you might be doing yourself a big favor. Okay, so that is proportioned pretty close, at least through the body end of things, to the way it should be. There we go. Okay, so that's pretty good. I'm reasonably happy with that for a start. Now, of course, the head's going to end up being a sphere. Let's tackle these legs first. So I have a choice here. I can either make the legs as a separate object. I can tab into edit mode on the body and start adding the legs on as part of the same object by adding a new primitive into the mesh there. Or, you know, I could actually make them as a separate object like I mentioned before and then add them to the same mesh later. And I might take that approach actually. Let's do that. So I'm in object mode right now, so if I add a new primitive, it's going to be its own object. Before we go there, let's name our object here. That's always a good practice. So instead of cube, we're going to call this robot.body. And now I'm going to click create, and I'm going to create another cube because this is cube modeling, right? And I'm going to shrink this thing down. This is not mirrored, remember, because it's a new object here, and I'm going to bring this over and just kind of place it roughly where I want the leg. Then I'm going to go over to my modifier stack here, and I'm going to add a mirror modifier. And you can see that it is set to mirror the x-axis, but it's not really doing anything. So let's undo that movement that I did first of all. Undo, undo. So this is centered along the x-axis here. If I add my modifier now, the reason that modifier didn't work before is that the origin of my object is the point of mirroring. So if I move this object over here, you can see the origin is still in the middle of the object. And basically a cube that is mirroring either side of itself around its center just looks like two cubes occupying the exact same point in space. So mirroring doesn't actually do anything useful there. So I'm going to add a mirror modifier now, and then I tab into edit mode, because if I move this geometry in edit mode, I'm not actually moving the origin of the object. So if I move this out here now, you can see that I've kind of split that out, and I've got a cube on either side now. That's because the mirror modifier is in fact working for me. So I can I'm going to move this in object mode just to kind of keep the origin in the center of the y-axis of the geometry here roughly, and then tab back into edit mode, and I'm just going to start doing the exact same thing. I'm going to kind of roughly block in this shape. Whoops, gotta deselect the other side first, huh? Kind of block in the shape here. Extrude, scale, grab, scale, and I think I'll extrude it one more time. Scale. I'm going to hit Shift X so that I'm going to scale this way down, and I don't really want it to get super skinny in the X axis, which is the axis I'm looking down right now. And let's just describe the top of this thing. Extrude, scale, Shift X again. Okay. From a front view, you can kind of see that's how the legs are looking. They're a little on the thick side. So let's, I have part of it selected, so let's hit Control L to just select all that geometry, scale that in X. And it looks to me like I can probably scale these in X. So just to kind of accomplish that sort of rounded shape that our student has going in the leg shape back there. So SX, SX, just kind of keep that scaling going back and forth. And actually I'm not going to scale that one. SX. I get this feeling that I'm really messing up my geometry here, and yep, I sure am. S, X. I kind of want these ends to end up roughly the same size. Okay. SX. Just kind of let that whole thing taper in. Control L, grab it in X, and line it up there a little bit. This right here doesn't look right to me. Let's see where that sits. Okay, so that is okay, so this is an interesting design. Alright, I'm gonna go with it for now. We'll kind of see how this whole thing works out. Okay, so it's time to make the lower leg now. As I mentioned in class, what seems to be drawn here would be what's called a clevis in machining terms. So let's do a loop cut here, and I want this clevis to be straight. You can see it's kind of got a taper to it, so I'm going to hit escape. I don't want to slide these things. I want them to be perfectly centered, and then I'm going to select one loop at a time here, SX0, to flatten them out, right? Scale in X by 0, because scaling is a multiplicative operation. So then I look around and just kind of make sure that whole thing worked with the layout here, and it did. So now I can delete these faces right here. Delete those faces. Bonk. Okay, and then I can now get my edge select mode going, and I can fill these faces in here that I have now left empty into an infinitely thin walled open spaced leg part that doesn't really work in real life. So let's fill that. There we go. Okay, and seems like everybody in class really wanted to see how you would punch a hole in this whole apparatus here. So I'm going to tap I to do an inset, kind of shrink these things down here, and then go to my side view, and I'm going to start moving all this stuff around here. Oops. Let's see. Looks like this needs to be a little bit larger in this particular axis here. Okay, and I've got the bottom of this shape shaped all wrong now, and for now I'm just going to leave that alone. I can also see that these vertices aren't quite lining up. I want them to line up perfectly, so basically what I don't want to do, if I do a scale operation by 0, I don't want them scaling in the x-axis and all smashing together and acting like one vertex. That's what that would look like. So basically from this perspective I can scale these Shift X 0, and then from the side perspective I can see they didn't move in X, but they moved in X or in Y and Z in every way they needed to be perfectly lined up. So S, whoop, come on, S Shift X 0, S Shift X 0. Okay, and now I can kind of move these around, and you know, that's probably a detail that might not be noticed later on, but it's also one of those things that I might be really glad I did it later on. So it's easiest to get things right while I'm working with a low polygon model, because every time I add a detail or a feature to this robot, it becomes a higher polygon mesh, and that makes it more difficult to manipulate and work with and change. And so it really, it pays not to get in too much of a hurry to see your creation finished. You know, it pays to take your time and just kind of get every part of it put together well and as correctly as you can. So I'm just kind of going to surround this circle here, and I don't really need to worry about the fact that I'm cutting a cubic hole into this robot, because I'm going to be using a subdivision surface modifier later. Faces, and that hole will become round, and I'll have to revisit it at that time. So I'm going to select an entire loop here by holding down Option and clicking. Option Shift click selects the next loop, and then Control E brings up my edge menu, and I can just say, hey, let's bridge those edge loops. Do the same thing on the other side. Option click, Option Shift click, Control E, bridge edge loops. Okay, now we've got contiguous holes all the way through. I also have pretty much the shape that I need to describe the top of the lower leg, the part that fits into this clevis. So, you know, as long as we're here, Option Shift click, Option Shift click, we're going to select all the faces that we need to actually become part of the upper leg. That's pretty simple to do. So I'm just going to duplicate these, Shift D, that loads my cursor with them. I'm going to hit Escape. So right now I actually have two sets of these faces occupying the exact same spot, and that's a bit of a nightmare. So I'm going to GZ -1, move the whole thing down by -1 blender units. And that's actually a little farther than I intended, so let's go let's undo that. GZ -0.1. Nope. GZ -0.25. There we go. So a quarter of a blender unit down. And because I typed in an increment that I know, I can move it back perfectly with ease after I finish kind of modeling this thing. So you can see the shape that this came out as. Let's close off some of our ends here. Option click and then F just to put a face there. Option click and tap F to put a face in. And we can do the same thing here. Not F. Control E, bring up your edge menu and bridge those edge loops. Okay, so you might notice how this is looking kind of dark and negative-y. It's not really shading properly. That's because basically I took the inside of the mesh up here and made it the outside of the mesh down here. So the normals are all pointing in the wrong direction. Let's select this whole thing, Control L, and fix that while we're thinking about it. Let's go over to Shading/UVs and recalculate our normals. That's this guy right here. Okay, and you can see that fixed it, and that'll save us from the rendering problems that would have been introduced with that later. Okay, so from here I can now actually just take this and GZ 0.25, put it right back into place, and I can select one of my faces here, go to a side view, and just kind of, I can start extruding out the rest of the lower leg here. So let's scale Z by 0, let's flatten that whole thing out and just kind of try to get the right shape coming out here. So scale, Shift X. I don't want this getting wider because it's as wide as it can possibly be coming out of this clevis. There we go, and that's probably a good start for our leg. Extrude, S, Shift X. I'm going to avoid scaling in X at all right now because I'm going to deal with the X dimensions of this leg when I get to the front view. I'm just not even going to deal with it right now. E to extrude, rotate, grab, scale, Shift X. Let's just get this right in one axis first. E to extrude, rotate, grab, S, Shift X, scale in not the X axis. E to extrude, grab it, rotate it. Now I'm going to flatten it perfectly by SZ0, scale, Shift X. I don't want this scaling in X. Okay. So grab it in Y. There we go. Alright. So now from a front view you can see that this whole thing is quite off. And I think I'm going to have to take a little bit of artistic license here and I'm just going to have to say, okay, let's, you know what, let's grab this whole side here. And I'm going to grab it in X. See what that's doing. That is that's probably messing up our Clevis a little, so let's deselect this top, grab it in X. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to grab my edges here and just sort of grab them in the x-axis, and I'm going to keep working up with these edges to kind of describe the outer shape of this thing, this leg. Grab an X, and we'll grab the exact same edges on the inside and do the exact same thing with them. GX, GX. Okay, so that's roughly the shape of our feet. You can see that mechanically those would work. Okay, that clevis is not going to start like rubbing or clipping through the thigh. Basically, the lower leg, we don't want it to touch there. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. That's probably fine. And let's build a head for this robot here. So from this point, I'm going to create a UV sphere. I'll just use kind of the default. Whoops, I'm going to undo that. I'm still in edit mode on the legs. Let's tab out. Let's name this object cube. We'll call this robot.legs. And now that we're in object mode, we will create a new object out of a UV sphere. We'll get it into the right position and scale it. It's probably getting pretty close. Okay. So that's looking reasonably good. Now we've got this mouth is going to be a fun little thing to deal with, but let's start with the eyes. So you can see that between the front view, the eyes look perfectly round, and on the side view, they're kind of ellipses that are flattened in one direction, and they're you know, across the x-axis of the ellipse, which you know, of course in this view is our y-axis. But anyway, to me that shows perspective. That says basically that this thing is facing forward but not completely forward. So again, a little bit of artistic license here we're probably going to have to take as far as like how do we place this. So these eyes look like they're going to best be described by a cylinder, so I'm going to create a cylinder shape. I don't need this many vertices probably because this cylinder is going to be fairly small, so I'm going to cut that in half. Let's go to 16 vertices. I never use n-gons, so I'm going to change the fill type to a triangle fan. And the depth doesn't need to be nearly that deep. Let's take that down quite a bit, and of course the radius can also be much smaller. And let's tell this to align to view so that we can actually kind of compare it to what it should end up looking like. And it's inside, so I can't really see it. I'm going to hold down Shift while I adjust this value so that I get a little bit of a smaller eyeball there. Okay. Now, before I move this off of the center from the x-axis, I'm going to add a mirror modifier, then tab into edit mode, and then I'll start to move it, and that allows me to, of course, mirror my mesh across the x-axis and kind of start to describe this thing a little better. So let's see what that looks like from a side view. Not very well placed, so let's grab that in the y-axis and kind of start to move it forward a little. Let's see how that comes out now. So what we've got here is a bit of an impossible shape. The eyes cannot be in this position from a front view, and also in this position on a side view, which is interesting. So we've got to make an artistic decision here, and this is the kind of thing that you can typically run into very easily when you draw a shape first. You know, you're not necessarily solving all of your problems in 3D, although you are solving a number of them. So I'm going to say let's see what this looks like if we just move the eyes forward. Let's grab these in the y-axis until they start to poke out a little bit, a little more. GY, let's get them all the way out and just kind of see how that looks from a side view. And that might be okay. Let's roll with it for now. If we decide we don't like it later, we can always come back and try something else. So I'm going to give these eyes just a little bit of detail since this is a robot. I'm going to do a loop, cut, and slide, and I'm actually going to smash this all the way into the next loop there, and I have confidence that that's not going to negatively affect me because I can always select this whole thing here, all of the faces on top, and I can scale that down. And now the loop cut that I just did is now forming this outermost edge, and it's right where the old edge of the cylinder used to be. But that gives me the freedom to kind of scale things inward here and then extrude back a little bit. I can't go very far, can I, because I start running into that sphere, but that gives us a little bit more of a mechanical kind of robot-y, this is a lens look to this robot. Okay, so that's good. Let's name this object robot.eyes. And now let's start getting into some of the details of kind of how to refine this. We're really starting to push this in terms of time. So I'm going to select the body and I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier. Right here. There we go. And I'm going to go to Tools and Smooth Shade it, tab into Edit Mode. And the thing I'm also going to do is over here, this little button on the subsurf modifier, I'm going to apply the edit cage to my model. Just edit cage to modify a result. So now you can see that it's actually showing my vertices and everything where they're falling according to what the subsurf modifier is doing. And that allows me to come in here and start much more precisely matching the artwork with my subsurf smoothed results. I can do this in wireframe mode, just to kind of make selection a little more obvious and maybe a little easier. There we go. Okay, so from a front view, you can see this whole thing actually needs to be scaled out. I have to be really careful about scaling in X because this is mirrored, and you can see that everything on the X-axis on the inside there starts kind of going into the clipping zone, and that's not what I want at all. So I've got to be a little bit careful there. So let's just kind of grab the rib cage here and move it out in the X-axis, and that's starting to look promising, like maybe we're getting close to the shape that we should have there. Okay, so I'm going to say that looks pretty good. Let's look at it from a top view. Could probably widen the tail out just a little bit, but it doesn't look too bad. I mean, we really are getting pretty close to the model, or to the original drawing here. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier to the legs. Do the same thing. Subdivision surface, we'll smooth shade it, and we're going to apply or adjust our edit cage to the modifier result. This one we're going to have to look at things in wireframe mode so that we can actually even still see the drawing, the model sheet. You can see that this subdivision surface modifier, it has a tendency to kind of shrink things back a little bit, which makes sense, you know, once you understand what it's doing. Makes sense that everything would kind of shrink. Okay, so this could be a little tricky here. Let's see. We need to do some subdivisions, or some loop cuts here to sharpen these edges. So Control R, and just kind of slide those things as far as they can go to one side or the other to really sharpen the edges. Oh, whoops, I missed. Control Z. Control R. There we go. Let's get this thing shaped right. We need to do the same thing inside the clevis on both sides of both holes. And that's not always easy to visualize in your head, but it's not too bad once you just kind of realize what the loop cuts are doing for you. So let's loop cuts up here, loop cuts up here. Okay, so that's a lot sharper looking, a little more robotic looking, kind of a futuristic plasticky robot, I guess. I'm gonna select just the, well, everything except the shins here now. So Control I inverts my selection. If I select the shins, or the lower leg, and then hit Control I, it selects the upper thigh, and I'm going to tap H to hide that temporarily and get it out of my way. So I can now perform the same operations on these lower leg parts a little more easily. Just a couple of loop cuts. For each part here, so that each end becomes a lot more solid looking. Okay, you can see that that's actually fitting together pretty well. It sharpened the edges of the shins, but actually I think I kind of like it that way. It definitely increases the robotic feel of this to me. Now the thighs here are penetrating the body, which is another area that we've kind of got to deal with. So let's see what we can figure out. Let's do a loop cut here, and you can see that this kind of needs some distance to sort of soften that arch of the back. We don't want this thing to look like it has a goose egg on its back or something like that. Okay, and what I'm wondering is if I can't take these faces right here and kind of extrude them in a way that will make sense, to sort of just have them kind of dodge around the thighs there, you know, the way sort of a cutout like you would do in a toy or something like that. Since this is supposed to be a robot, I think that might work. Let's see, let's get this vertex out of our way a little bit. Okay, so now if I were to select these faces here, these 4 faces, and then extrude them inward just a little, SX0, let's just scale that in X by a factor of 0, GX, grab it in X, and just kind of see if we can't move that out of our own way just a little bit. Like I say, we've got to take some artistic license here, because once you take, I mean, you can draw things on two-dimensional paper that just simply won't work in 3D. Once you start actually modeling them in 3D, some of the problems start to become a little more apparent. Let's see if we can't get this closer to our leg. I don't want it to look like this thing's just missing a big chunk of itself, like it's a shark bite victim or something like that. So I'm basically just kind of adjusting our mesh here to really just barely kind of go around that leg. And I'll probably have to come back later, because now that I'm thinking about this, if this leg starts turning, it's going to run into you know, the portions of the body that it's near. But for now, let's say that looks okay. And oh, I've still got to, if I tab into edit mode on the legs, I've still got the upper thighs hidden. So let's Option H, unhides them, and I can now kind of take the insides of this thigh portion, and I can kind of bring them back in here. Again, I'm taking some artistic license with this image, or with this robot, but I think it kind of has to be done here. Okay, so I'm going to sharpen up the edges of this cavity here a little bit as well with just another loop cut. I can see I've introduced a problem of some sort back here. Okay. So that's actually looking okay. All right, and we have been going for almost an hour, so I'm going to stop this tutorial now, and we'll continue this on in a later session. But hopefully this gives you a good idea of sort of how to get started with this kind of a project. So I'm going to save my work, and then we'll start a new tutorial later. Thank you. Good luck.